Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from small towns across Ohio. These are tales of ordinary people who encountered something in the quiet corners of the state that defied explanation, something that still haunts them years later. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. I inherited my uncle's farmhouse outside of Mesopotamia when I was 32. The place had been sitting empty for about 8 months after he passed, and honestly, I'd been avoiding dealing with it. Not because I didn't care. Uncle Gerald had basically raised me after my dad left, but because going through someone's belongings feels like trespassing on their privacy, even after they're gone. The house sat on about 40 acres of land that backed up against a state forest. Dense woods, the kind where the canopy gets so thick that even at noon it looks like late evening underneath. Gerald used to joke that he paid for 2 properties, the cleared land around the house and the free darkness that came with the forest behind it. I drove out there on a Thursday in late October. The leaves were that burnt orange color they get right before they fall, and there was a smell in the air like wet bark and chimney smoke, even though none of the neighboring properties were close enough to see. I'd brought my dog, a border collie mix named Pepper, figuring the company would make the whole thing less depressing. She'd always loved Gerald's place. He'd let her run wild in the fields while I was there. The house was exactly as I remembered it. Single-story white siding that needed painting, a covered porch that wrapped around the front and east side. Gerald's truck was still parked in the gravel driveway, covered in pollen and dead leaves. I remember thinking I should probably get it running before winter, maybe drive it back to Cleveland rather than pay for a tow. Inside, everything was still. Not peaceful, just still. Like the air itself was waiting. Gerald had been a neat person, almost obsessive about it, so there wasn't the chaos you might expect from someone who died suddenly. Mail was stacked on the kitchen counter. Dishes were put away. His reading glasses sat folded on the arm of his recliner, a bookmark holding his place in some Tom Clancy novel. I spent the first few hours just wandering room to room, not really accomplishing anything. Opening drawers, looking at photos on the walls. Gerald had never married, never had kids, so most of the pictures were of me at various ages. School photos, baseball games, that trip we took to Put-in-Bay when I was 14. Pepper followed me around for a while, then curled up on the living room rug and fell asleep. Around 4 o'clock, I decided to check the basement. Gerald had always kept tools down there, and I figured I should see what was worth keeping versus what I should haul to Goodwill. The basement door was in the kitchen, next to the pantry. Solid wood, the old kind with the crystal doorknob. When I pulled it open, cooler air drifted up from below, carrying that distinct basement smell, concrete, dust, maybe a hint of mildew. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight. I'd been down there maybe 3 times in my entire life. Gerald had never liked people going through his things, and the basement was definitely his space. But at the bottom of the stairs, I found it was just like the rest of the house. Organized. Clean. Metal shelving units lined one wall, holding labeled boxes and plastic bins. His workbench was immaculate, tools hanging from a pegboard in perfect arrangement. What caught my attention was the far corner, where the concrete floor met the stone foundation wall. There was a section maybe 4 feet wide where the stones looked new. Not brand new, but definitely not original to the house. The mortar was a slightly different color, and the stones themselves were more uniform in size. I walked over and ran my hand along the surface. It felt solid enough, but when I knocked on it, the sound was hollow. Not like there was a room behind it, more like there was space. An air gap, maybe. I tried to remember if Gerald had ever mentioned doing foundation work, but nothing came to mind. That's when Pepper started barking upstairs. Not her normal bark. This was continuous, frantic, the kind of sound she made when she was genuinely scared. I headed back up the stairs, calling her name, and found her standing in the kitchen staring at the back door. Her hackles were raised, her whole body rigid. "What is it, girl?" She didn't even glance at me, just kept staring at that door, occasionally letting out a low growl that vibrated in her chest. I looked out the window above the sink. The backyard stretched about 50 feet before the tree line started. I didn't see anything. No deer, no other animals. Just the grass and the trees and the late afternoon shadows stretching across the lawn. I told myself she probably smelled a raccoon or a possum. The house had been empty for months. All kinds of animals had probably been nosing around the property. But something about the way she was acting made my palms damp. I spent the next hour trying to distract myself with sorting through kitchen cabinets, but I kept glancing at the back door. Pepper eventually calmed down and went back to the living room, though she positioned herself where she could still see the kitchen. By 6 o'clock, the sun was setting and I decided to call it a day. I'd come back on the weekend with proper boxes and maybe a friend to help me move furniture. I was loading the last of my things into the car when I noticed something on the back porch. Gerald's porch had these wooden floorboards that were painted gray, and they showed every scuff mark and footprint. What I was looking at were muddy prints leading from the steps to the back door. Not animal prints, boot prints, large ones like a work boot or hiking boot. My stomach did this slow turn. I walked closer, trying to remember if I'd gone onto the back porch at all. I hadn't. I'd only used the front door. The prints were fresh. The mud was still slightly damp, leaving faint smudges where the edges touched the wood. They led right up to the back door and then they stopped. There were no prints leading away. None going back down the steps. Just these 5 or 6 prints approaching the door and nothing else. I stood there staring at them for probably a full minute, my mind trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe they'd been there before I arrived and I just hadn't noticed. But the mud was damp, and I'd been in the kitchen multiple times. I would have seen someone on the back porch through the window, unless they'd been standing there while I was in the basement. That thought made something cold settle in my chest. I got in my car faster than I probably needed to and left, Pepper beside me in the passenger seat. The whole drive back to Cleveland, I kept checking the rearview mirror, though I couldn't have told you what I was looking for. I came back 3 days later with my friend Marcus. I didn't tell him about the footprints. It felt stupid in daylight back in the city. But when we pulled up to the house, the first thing I did was check the back porch. The prints were gone, not washed away by rain. It hadn't rained, not faded, just gone. The porch was clean, like it had been swept. And leaning against the back door, propped up carefully against the frame, was a piece of bark, stripped clean and smooth, about the size of a paperback book. Someone had carved something into it. It wasn't detailed, just simple lines burned or scratched into the surface. A tall figure, narrow, with long arms that hung down past where legs should be. No face. Just a blank oval for a head. Marcus came around the side of the house and saw me staring at it. "What's that?" I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the tree line, at the dark spaces between the trunks where the shadows pooled and didn't move. "Nothing," I said finally, though we both knew I was lying. Someone's idea of a joke. But I took the piece of bark with me when we left. It's in a drawer in my apartment now, wrapped in a grocery bag. I sold the property 4 months later to a developer, took a loss on it just to be done with the whole thing. Sometimes I wonder if I should have warned the new owners, but what would I say? That someone left me a carving, that there were footprints that disappeared. I did call the Wayne County Sheriff's Office before the sale went through. Asked if there'd been any break-ins or trespassing reports in the area. The deputy I spoke to said the only calls they'd gotten were from Gerald himself, years back. Said he'd reported someone on his property at night, someone moving through the trees behind his house. They sent an officer out to check, but they never found anyone. The deputy mentioned that Gerald had called multiple times over the course of a year, always the same complaint. Eventually, they'd stopped responding, figured it was just an old man getting paranoid living alone out there. That was 2 weeks before Gerald died. Heart attack, the coroner said. Found him in the backyard, face down in the grass, about 10 feet from the tree line. I don't go out to Mesopotamia anymore. I take the long way around if I'm driving anywhere near Joga County. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about those footprints. About how they only led toward the door, never away. About how something stood on that porch looking in while I was down in the basement with my back turned. Story 2. Mariah and I had been planning the hiking trip to Zaleski State Forest for months. We were both teachers, her middle school, me elementary, and summer break was the only time we could actually coordinate our schedules. The plan was simple: backpack the 23-mile trail over 3 days, camp at the designated sites, disconnect from technology, all that cliched outdoor stuff that sounds better on Instagram than it actually is in practice. We started the trail on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. The forecast had called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 80s, perfect hiking weather. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when we arrived. Just one other car, an older Subaru with a kayak strapped to the roof. The ranger station had a sign saying they were understaffed and to practice leave no trace principles. Mariah was in a good mood, singing off-key to whatever song was stuck in her head. She'd packed about 15 pounds of camera equipment because she was convinced she was going to get magazine-worthy shots for her photography side business. I'd packed practically water filtration, first aid, an actual map and compass because I didn't trust phone GPS out here. The first day was uneventful in the best way. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest, occasionally opening up to views of the Raccoon Creek Valley. We saw deer, a red-tailed hawk, and one extremely fat groundhog that Mariah insisted on photographing from about 12 different angles. By late afternoon, we reached our first campsite, a cleared area with a fire ring and a bare box for food storage. We set up our tents, filtered water from a nearby creek, made dinner on Mariah's camp stove. As the sun went down, we sat by the fire and talked about nothing important. Gossip about coworkers, plans for the school year, whether we were too old to still be sleeping on the ground in tents. Mariah was 36, I was 34. The answer was probably yes, but neither of us wanted to admit it. I remember the woods getting quiet around 9 o'clock. Not gradually, it was like someone had turned down a volume knob. The crickets and tree frogs that had been providing constant background noise just stopped. Mariah noticed it too. She looked up from her phone, which she'd been using as a flashlight to find something in her pack. "That's weird," she said. We sat there listening to the silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, we heard a voice. It was distant, hard to make out, but it sounded like someone calling for help. A woman's voice, high and strained. "Hello, is someone there, please?" Mariah and I looked at each other. "Should we?" she started, but I was already standing up, grabbing my flashlight. "Hello," I called back. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response, just that same voice still calling out, "Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" The voice seemed to be coming from the north, off the trail. Mariah grabbed her flashlight too, and we started walking in that direction, calling out every few steps. The forest floor was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and exposed roots that made walking treacherous in the dark. We probably went about 100 yards when I realized something was wrong. The voice hadn't gotten any closer. It still sounded the same distance away, the same volume, even though we'd been walking toward it for several minutes. I stopped to wait. Mariah stopped beside me, breathing hard. "What?" "Listen." The voice was still calling, but now I could hear it more clearly. and there was something off about it. The words were right, please and help, and I'm lost. But the cadence was wrong. Like someone reading from a script without any emotion behind it. Like a recording being played on loop. Hello, is someone there, please? Exactly the same as before. Same pitch, same rhythm. We should go back, I said quietly. Mariah was already backing up. Yeah, okay. We returned to our campsite, moving faster than we probably should have given the terrain. The voice continued calling for a few more minutes, then stopped abruptly. The normal forest sounds didn't come back. Everything stayed silent. We didn't sleep much that night. Mariah stayed in her tent and I stayed in mine, and we both kept our flashlights within arm's reach. Every little sound, the wind moving through leaves, a branch creaking, made my heart rate spike. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps circling the perimeter of the campsite. Not trying to be quiet. I laid there frozen, barely breathing, listening to something walk around and around. I wanted to look outside, to unzip the tent flap and shine my light, but I couldn't make my body move. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could see a shadow through the nylon, backlit by moonlight. Tall, very tall. It stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a minute or two. Then it moved on. I heard the footsteps continue around the site, past Mariah's tent, past the cold fire ring, and then fade into the distance. In the morning, Mariah looked as exhausted as I felt. Neither of us mentioned what had happened until we packed up our gear and started hiking. Then she said, very quietly, "Something walked around my tent last night." Mine too. We decided to skip the second campsite and try to push through to the third, even though that would make for a brutal 14-mile day. Anything to avoid spending another night in the same spot. The trail that morning seemed darker, even though the sun was out. The trees felt closer, more oppressive. We didn't talk much, just focused on putting distance between ourselves and that campsite. Around noon, we stopped for lunch at a stream crossing. While Mariah filtered water, I noticed something carved into a tree trunk about 10 feet off the trail. Letters, maybe 6 inches tall, cut deep into the bark. "Go back." The letters were weathered, probably years old. But underneath them, scratched more recently, were 3 words in what looked like charcoal or burnt wood. SHES not lost. My appetite disappeared. I showed Mariah and she went pale. "Let's just get out of here," she said. "Let's skip the third site too. Let's just hike straight through to the trailhead." I agreed immediately. We repacked our things and started moving faster, our packs bouncing against our backs with every step. The trail seemed longer than the map indicated. Features we should have passed, a particular rock formation, a wooden bridge, never appeared. At one point, I pulled out my compass and realized we were somehow heading west when the trail should have been going south. Mariah noticed I'd stopped. "What's wrong?" "We're going the wrong direction." "That's impossible. We've been following the trail markers." I looked around. She was right, there were the white blazes painted on trees indicating the trail route. But my compass was insistent. We were heading west. We backtracked to the last intersection, took what should have been a different fork. My compass still said west. The sun, which should have been to our left if we were heading south, was directly in front of us. "This doesn't make sense," Mariah said, and I could hear panic creeping into her voice. That's when we heard the voice again. Closer this time. Much closer. "Hello, is someone there, please?" It was coming from directly ahead of us, maybe 50 yards away through the trees. And I could see movement now, something pale shifting between the dark trunks. "Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" The voice was still flat, still emotionless, but now I could see the source. A figure standing in the forest, partially hidden behind a thick oak. I couldn't make out details, just that it was tall and pale and completely motionless except for its head, which was turning slowly back and forth like it was scanning the woods. The voice was coming from it, but its mouth, if it had a mouth, wasn't moving. "Hello, is someone there?" Mariah grabbed my arm, her fingers dug in hard enough to bruise. "Run," she whispered. We ran. I don't know how long we ran or in what direction. We abandoned the trail completely, just crashed through underbrush and over fallen logs, our packs slamming against our shoulders and backs. Branches whipped at our faces. I lost my hat. Mariah's water bottle came loose from her pack and bounced away into the leaves. Behind us, that voice kept calling. "Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" It never got further away. I don't remember exactly how we found the trailhead. One moment we were surrounded by endless forest, and the next we burst out onto the gravel parking lot, both of us gasping for air, covered in scratches and dirt. Our car was there. The Subaru was gone. We threw our packs in the trunk and got inside, locking the doors even though that seemed ridiculous. Mariah's hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back at the trailhead. Standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, was that tall, pale figure, watching us leave. We drove in silence for almost an hour until we were well clear of Vinton County. Finally, Mariah pulled into a gas station and we both just sat there in the parking lot, neither of us willing to talk about what had happened. Eventually, I said, "Did you see?" "Yes." "What was?" "I don't know. We never reported it. What would we say to who?" We left our unused permits in the ranger box at the trailhead and never went back. 3 weeks later, Mariah sent me a link to a news article. A hiker had been found dead on the Zaleski Trail, about a mile from where we'd camped that first night. The article said she'd been reported missing 2 years ago, and they just found her remains. They were calling it exposure, saying she must have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. But what got me was the detail at the end. The ranger they interviewed mentioned that the woman's hiking partner had reported hearing her calling for help the night she went missing. He'd searched for hours but never found her. They'd found her body sitting upright against a tree, positioned like she was resting. Her backpack and gear were neatly arranged beside her, and carved into the tree above her head, in letters a foot tall, was one word: help. I sold all my camping gear that week. Mariah won't even drive through Vinton County anymore. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I can still hear that voice in my head. "Hello, is someone there, please?" Always the same, always flat, always wrong. Story 3. The town of Congo sits in the far eastern edge of Ohio, right up against the Pennsylvania border. Population maybe 400 on a good day, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and strangers get noticed immediately. My boyfriend Trevor grew up there, though he'd moved to Youngstown for work about 5 years before we met. His father passed away in early March, sudden, a stroke while he was watching TV in his living room. Trevor's mother had died when he was a teenager, so there was no one else to handle the estate, which meant going back to Congo to clean out the house and get it ready to sell. I offered to go with him. We'd been dating about 8 months at that point, serious enough that meeting extended family and helping with this kind of thing felt appropriate. Trevor seemed relieved to have the company, said the house had always creeped him out even when his dad was alive. We drove out on a Saturday morning, my car packed with cleaning supplies, trash bags, and cardboard boxes. The house was on the southern edge of town, a 2-story colonial that had probably been nice in the 1970s, but had since fallen into that state of benign neglect that happens when someone gets old and stops seeing the point of maintenance. The inside smelled like old newspapers and coffee. Trevor's dad had been a smoker too, so there was that underlying staleness that gets into the walls and furniture. We spent the first few hours just sorting things into piles, keep, donate, trash. Trevor moved through the house mechanically, not really looking at anything, just making decisions and moving on. Around lunchtime, we took a break, ordered pizza from the only place in town that delivered. While we waited, I wandered upstairs to check out the bedrooms. Trevor's childhood room was frozen in time, posters of 90s bands on the walls, a shelf full of basketball trophies, a desktop computer that probably hadn't been turned on since Clinton was president. The master bedroom was tidy in that obsessive way some elderly people maintain. Bed made with hospital corners. Prescription bottles lined up on the nightstand in alphabetical order. But what caught my attention was the window. It faced the backyard, which sloped down gradually toward a line of trees maybe 100 yards away. Between the house and the trees was just grass, unmowed and overgrown. But someone had driven stakes into the ground in a wide semicircle around the back of the property. Wooden stakes, maybe 4 feet tall, spaced about 10 feet apart. Between each stake was string, not rope string like twine or fishing line, and hanging from the string were objects. I couldn't make them out clearly from the window, but they looked like bundles of something, little dark shapes that twisted slowly in the wind. I called Trevor upstairs. "What is that?" He looked out the window and his expression went carefully neutral. "Oh, that. What is it?" My dad he got weird the last few years. Paranoid. He thought something was coming out of the woods at night. Something. Trevor shrugged uncomfortably. He never said what, just that he needed to mark the boundary, keep things out. I tried to get him to see someone, talk to a doctor, but you know how old people can be about mental health. The pizza arrived, and we ate downstairs in the kitchen, not talking about the stakes or the string or what it meant that Trevor's dad had spent his last years building. What? A barrier. A warning system. We worked until about 9 that evening, filling up the back of my car with bags of clothes and books for Goodwill. I was exhausted and suggested we get a motel, but Trevor insisted we stay at the house. Said it would be easier to start fresh in the morning, and besides, it felt wrong to let the place sit empty when we were right there. I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but I also didn't want to make a big deal out of it. We made up the bed in Trevor's old room with clean sheets from my apartment and settled in for the night. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of Trevor talking. Not to me. He was still asleep, lying on his back with his eyes closed, but he was speaking in a low, continuous monotone. I couldn't make out the words at first. It was like he was having a conversation with someone, responding to questions I couldn't hear. I shook his shoulder. "Trevor, hey, wake up." He stopped talking but didn't wake up. Just went silent, still breathing deeply in sleep. I laid there in the dark, listening to the house settle and creak around us. Old houses do that, expand and contract, wood shifting against nails. But these sounds seemed purposeful, like footsteps on the stairs, deliberate and evenly spaced. I told myself it was nothing. Old house, strange place. My imagination filling in patterns where there weren't any. Then I heard tapping on the window, not random. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, regular as a heartbeat. I sat up, staring at the window. The curtains were drawn, just thin cotton that let in ambient light from the street. I could see the outline of the window frame, but nothing else. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Trevor was still asleep beside me. I reached over and shook him harder. "Trevor, wake up. There's something at the window." He came awake slowly, confused. "What?" "Listen." We sat there in silence. The tapping had stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. Then Trevor let out a breath. Probably just a branch in the wind. "There's no tree close enough to." 3 taps. Clear and distinct like knuckles on glass. Trevor got out of bed and walked to the window. I wanted to tell him not to, wanted to say we should just leave, get in the car and drive away. But I didn't. I just watched as he pulled back the curtain and looked out. He stood there for a long time, not moving. "Trevor, there's someone in the yard." I got up and joined him at the window. The backyard was illuminated by a nearly full moon, bright enough to see the overgrown grass and the line of stakes with their hanging strings. And standing between two of the stakes, right at the property line, was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet or more. It was hard to judge distance in the dark. The figure was just standing there, completely still, facing the house. "Is that a person?" I whispered. Trevor didn't answer. He was staring at the figure with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite fear, more like recognition. As we watched, the figure took a step forward. It moved slowly, deliberately, 1 foot in front of the other, but it didn't cross the line of stakes. It stopped right at the string, one long arm raised as if reaching toward us. Then it opened its mouth. I don't know how I could see that from this distance in this light, but I saw it. The mouth opened wide, far wider than any human mouth should, and it stayed open for several seconds. No sound came out. It just stood there with its mouth hanging open like a broken door. Then it stepped back, melted into the darkness beyond the stakes. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. Trevor closed the curtain. His hand was shaking. "We're leaving," he said. "Trevor, what was?" "We're leaving, now get your things." We were in the car and pulling out of the driveway within 10 minutes. Trevor didn't say a word the entire drive back to Youngstown. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following us, but there was only empty road and darkness. When we got back to his apartment, Trevor finally spoke. My dad wasn't paranoid. "What?" "He saw it, that thing. That's why he put up the stakes, the string. He was trying to keep it away from the house." "Trevor, we should call someone, the police or—" "And tell them what? That we saw something in the backyard. They'll think we're crazy." I didn't push it. We spent the rest of the night sitting in his living room with all the lights on, neither of us willing to go to sleep. A week later, Trevor hired an estate sale company to handle the rest of the house. He never went back. The property sold 2 months after that to a young couple from Pittsburgh looking for cheap real estate. I looked them up on Facebook once. Their page is still active. Lots of pictures of home renovations and DIY projects. But they haven't posted anything in about 4 months. The last post is a picture of the backyard, the overgrown grass freshly mowed. You can see the stakes are gone in the photo. The string removed, the property line open. The caption says, "Finally cleared out all that weird junk the previous owner left. So much better now." There are no comments, no likes. I think about messaging them sometimes, warning them. But Trevor made me promise not to. Said it wouldn't help, that people don't listen to warnings about things they can't understand. He's probably right. But I still think about that figure standing at the property line. About its mouth opening wide and empty. About the stakes that Trevor's father had carefully driven into the ground, marking a boundary that something respected, until someone removed them. Story 4. I was working as a freelance nature photographer when I got the assignment to document spring wildflowers in Shawnee State Forest. The magazine wanted shots of the trilliums and bluebells, those early blooms that carpet the forest floor before the trees fully leaf out. It was a decent paying gig, and Shawnee was only about 2 hours from Cincinnati, so I jumped at it. I drove down on a Wednesday in mid-April. The weather was perfect, overcast sky providing soft, even light, temperature in the low 60s. I'd scouted some locations on Google Earth beforehand, marked a few promising spots that were off the main trails where I might find pristine patches of wildflowers without boot prints and trail erosion. The area I wanted to explore was in the northern section of the forest, accessible by a fire road that dead-ended at an old ranger cabin. The cabin was marked as inactive on the Forest Service map. meaning it wasn't staffed but was maintained for emergency shelter. I parked at the end of the fire road and loaded up my pack with camera equipment, water, and snacks. The plan was to hike in about a mile, shoot until the light got harsh, then hike back out. Simple. I'd done this kind of thing hundreds of times. The forest was beautiful, oak and hickory trees just starting to green up, the forest floor covered in hepatica and bloodroot. I spent the first hour just shooting, working my way deeper into the woods, following a dry creek bed that seemed like it would lead to good locations. I found the trilliums around noon, a massive patch of them, white and perfect, covering maybe half an acre of gentle hillside. Exactly what the magazine wanted. I set up my tripod and started shooting different angles, adjusting aperture and composition, completely absorbed in the work. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable under the normal forest scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. But as I moved through the trilliums, it got stronger, sweet and rotten at the same time, like meat that had been left in the sun. I assumed it was a dead deer somewhere nearby. You encounter that sometimes in the woods, and tried to work around it. But the smell seemed to be coming from everywhere. Not stronger in any one direction, just a constant presence that made my stomach uneasy. I was adjusting my tripod when I saw the first bone. It was hanging from a low branch about 20 feet away, tied there with what looked like wire. A long bone, probably a femur from a deer or maybe a coyote, bleached white by weather and sun. I straightened up, leaving my camera, and walked over to it. The bone swung slightly in the breeze. The wire was wrapped around both ends and looped over the branch, holding it suspended about 5 feet off the ground. That's when I realized there were more of them. Bones hanging throughout the trilliums, spread out over the hillside. Ribs and vertebrae and long limb bones, all suspended by wire from branches at roughly the same height. Maybe 20 or 30 of them total, scattered through the flowers like some kind of grotesque mobile art installation. My photographer brain kicked in. This was weird enough to be interesting, maybe worth documenting. But my survival brain was screaming at me to leave. This wasn't natural. This wasn't random. Someone had done this deliberately, and I had no idea why. I backed away from the bone, back toward my tripod. That's when I noticed the cabin. I hadn't seen it before because it was set back from the creek bed, partially hidden by brush and trees. But it was there, maybe 100 yards uphill from where I'd been shooting. Not the ranger cabin from the map, this was something else. Smaller, older. The roof was mostly intact, but the windows were dark and the door hung open at an angle. I should have left right then, packed up my gear and hiked back to my car. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I was still in that mindset where weird discoveries feel exciting rather than threatening. I approached the cabin slowly, camera in hand. The porch was rotted through in places, and I could see into the dim interior through the open door. There wasn't much inside. An overturned table, some empty shelves, what looked like an old camp stove in the corner, but the walls were covered in writing. I stepped carefully through the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The writing was in pencil or charcoal, covering every visible surface. Not words, symbols, repeated over and over in dense, overlapping patterns. Circles and crosses and shapes I didn't recognize. Some were small and precise, others large and frantic, carved so deep into the wood that they'd gouged into the underlying structure. In the center of the largest wall was a phrase written in English. "It walks at night. It takes the voice. Mark the trees." My hands were shaking. I backed out of the cabin, suddenly very aware of how alone I was, how far from my car, how no one knew exactly where I was shooting today. That's when I heard the singing. It was coming from deeper in the woods, past the cabin, from somewhere in the thicker vegetation uphill. A woman's voice, singing something wordless, just melody rising and falling. It was pretty in a strange way, almost hypnotic. I stood frozen on the cabin porch, listening. The voice wasn't moving. It stayed in one spot, just continuing that wordless song. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. The singing was somehow compelling, like it was pulling at something in my chest. Then I noticed the trees. Around the cabin, maybe a dozen trees had marks carved into them. Not the symbols from inside, these were different. Deep gouges cut into the bark at about chest height, 3 parallel lines that looked like claw marks. They formed a rough circle around the cabin, like a boundary. The singing continued. I realized with a jolt that it was getting closer. Not moving closer, getting louder, like someone was slowly turning up the volume. I ran. I left my tripod, left my camera bag, just grabbed my camera body and ran downhill toward the creek bed. Behind me, the singing was getting louder and louder, that wordless melody echoing through the trees. I don't remember the hike back to my car clearly. I know I fell at least twice, scraped my hands on rocks, twisted my ankle slightly on a root. But I kept moving, crashing through underbrush and over fallen logs until I burst out onto the fire road. My car was still there. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for several minutes catching my breath. My hands were bleeding. My pants were torn, but I was out. The singing had stopped. The forest was quiet again, just normal bird sounds and wind in the trees. I drove back to Cincinnati and never contacted the magazine. Never delivered the photos. I couldn't explain why without sounding insane, so I just told them the assignment didn't work out. But about a week later, I was going through the photos on my camera. I hadn't looked at them since getting back. Most were the trillium shots I'd taken before finding the bones. But there were 3 photos at the end that I didn't remember taking. They were dark, poorly focused, like someone had picked up my camera and shot without looking through the viewfinder. But I could make out shapes in the images. Trees. The cabin, and in the last photo, barely visible in the shadows behind the cabin, something tall and pale standing among the trees. It had no distinct features, just a vertical shape, lighter than the surrounding darkness. But in the photo, you could see what might have been a mouth open wide, impossibly wide, like it was mid-song. I deleted all 3 photos immediately. Then I deleted them from the trash. Then I took my camera to a shop and had them wipe the memory card completely, told them I'd accidentally corrupted it. I still do nature photography, but I don't take assignments in Southern Ohio anymore. And I never, ever hike alone into areas marked as inactive on Forest Service maps. Sometimes I wonder about that cabin, about the person who wrote those warnings on the walls, about what they were marking the trees to keep away. But mostly I try not to think about the singing. About how beautiful it was. About how much I wanted to follow it deeper into the woods. About how, sometimes late at night, I can still hear it in my head. Story 5. My sister Danielle went missing in 2019. She was hiking the Buckeye Trail section that runs through Wayne National Forest, doing a solo backpacking trip that was supposed to take 5 days. When she didn't show up at the endpoint, my parents reported her missing, and the search and rescue teams found her tent at a campsite on the 3rd day. Everything was still there. Her backpack, her sleeping bag, even her phone charging from a portable battery. But no Danielle. They searched for 2 weeks. Brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers. Nothing. She'd simply vanished. The authorities eventually classified it as a missing person case with suspected foul play, though they had no evidence of what might have happened. My family held a memorial service 6 months later, even though we never had a body to bury. I couldn't accept it. Danielle was careful, experienced. She'd been hiking and camping since we were kids. The idea that she'd just wander off and get lost made no sense. So 18 months after she disappeared, I went back to Wayne National Forest myself. I wanted to retrace her route, see if I could find anything the search teams had missed. I know that sounds stupid, like grief was making me act irrationally, and maybe it was, but I had to do something. The not knowing was killing my parents, and I thought, I don't know. I thought maybe I'd find closure or answers or something. I started at the same trailhead Danielle had used. It was October, cooler than when she disappeared, the leaves already starting to fall. I had her hiking plan that she'd filed with the Forest Service, knew exactly which campsites she'd intended to use. The first 2 days were uneventful. I reached the campsite where they'd found her tent. It looked like any other cleared space in the woods now, no indication anything bad had ever happened there. I set up my own tent and tried not to think about my sister sleeping in this exact spot, unaware of what was coming. At night I heard footsteps. I was lying in my sleeping bag, not quite asleep, when I heard someone walking past my tent. Slow, measured steps on the leaf litter. My first thought was another hiker, maybe someone else camping nearby, but the steps didn't move away. They circled my tent once, twice, then stopped right outside the door. I laid there holding my breath, listening, waiting for whoever it was to say something, to announce themselves, but there was only silence. Finally, I called out, "Hello? Can I help you?" No response. After a few seconds, the footsteps resumed, moving away into the forest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I broke camp earlier than planned and continued on the trail. Danielle's itinerary showed she would have been heading toward a more remote section of the forest, where the Buckeye Trail looped through some particularly rugged terrain. Around midday, I found the first marker. It was a cairn, a stack of rocks on the side of the trail, maybe 2 feet high. Cairns aren't unusual on hiking trails. People build them as landmarks or just out of boredom, but something about this one felt off. The rocks were stacked too deliberately, and on top was a piece of fabric. I picked it up. It was a bandana, faded blue, weathered by sun and rain, but I recognized it immediately. It was Danielle's. I'd given it to her for Christmas 3 years ago. My hand started shaking. She'd been here. This was proof she'd made it this far on the trail. I looked around, scanning the forest for any other signs. That's when I saw the second cairn, maybe 50 feet off the trail, deeper in the trees. And beyond that, another one. They formed a line leading away from the main trail into unmarked forest. I hesitated. The smart thing would be to mark the location, hike back, report this to the authorities. Let them investigate properly with equipment and backup. But these markers had been here for 18 months, through rain and snow and wind. If I left now, came back with help, they might be gone. This might be my only chance to find out what happened to my sister. I followed the cairns. They led me deep into the forest, away from any established trail. The terrain got rougher, steep hills, dense underbrush, fallen logs blocking the path. But every 100 feet or so, there was another cairn, guiding me forward. After about half a mile, the cairn stopped. I found myself standing in a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. The trees around the edges were marked. Someone had carved deep gouges into the bark, 4 parallel lines that could have been from claws or knives. In the center of the clearing was a hole, not a natural depression. This was deliberately dug, maybe 6 feet across, and from what I could see, very deep. The edges were perfect, almost surgically precise. I walked to the edge and looked down. The hole descended into darkness. I could see maybe 10 feet down before it became too dark to make out any details. I grabbed a rock and dropped it in, listening for the sound of it hitting bottom. I counted to 5 before I heard the distant clatter of impact. There was something at the edge of the hole, a backpack, muddy and weather-worn, but I recognized it. It was Danielle's. I grabbed it, pulling it away from the hole's edge. Most of the contents were ruined. Her water filter, a sweatshirt, some granola bars turned to mush. But in the top pocket, sealed in a plastic bag, was her journal. I sat down right there in the clearing and read it. The entries started normally. Descriptions of the trail, observations about the wildlife, complaints about a blister on her heel. But on the 4th day, the tone changed. Found something weird off trail. Stone markers leading into the woods. Looks like someone made a path. Going to check it out. The next entry. The path led to a clearing with a massive hole. Can't see the bottom. There are markings on the trees. They look like claw marks, but too deliberate to be from an animal. Starting to feel like I'm being watched. going to head back to the trail. The final entry was written in shaky handwriting, like she'd been scared or writing in a hurry. Something is following me. I've heard it every night since I found the clearing, footsteps around my tent. Last night I saw it through the fabric, tall, pale, standing right outside. It's waiting for something. I don't know what. I'm going to try to leave at first light, skip the rest of the trail and head straight to the nearest trailhead. If someone finds this and I'm not. The entry stopped mid-sentence. I was still holding the journal when I heard movement behind me. I spun around. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, with pale skin that seemed to glow slightly in the dim forest light. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then it smiled. Its mouth stretched wide across its face, far wider than any human could manage, revealing nothing behind the lips. Not teeth, not tongue, just darkness. I ran. I don't remember the route I took, whether I followed the cairns back or just crashed blindly through the forest. I remember falling, my hands and knees slamming into rocks and roots. I remember Danielle's backpack bouncing against my shoulders, her journal clutched in one hand. I remember that thing behind me. I never looked back, but I could hear it. Not footsteps, something else. A sliding sound, like it was moving through the trees rather than around them. I hit the main trail and kept running. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming, but I didn't stop. Not until I reached the trailhead parking lot in my car. I called 911 from the parking lot and told them everything. They sent deputies out and I led them to the general area where I'd found the clearing. But we couldn't find it. We searched for 3 hours and there were no cairns, no marked trees, no hole in the ground. Just normal forest. They took Danielle's backpack and journal as evidence. Last I heard, they're still listed as items of unknown origin in an ongoing investigation. I tried to explain what I'd seen, the figure in the clearing, the thing that chased me, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought grief and isolation had made me hallucinate. Maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined all of it. But 2 months ago I received a package. No return address, postmarked from somewhere in Wayne County. Inside was a photograph, not professionally developed, just a printout on regular paper. It showed a clearing in the forest, a hole in the ground, and standing at the edge, looking down into the darkness, was Danielle. The photo was dated the day she disappeared. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "She found it first." I keep the photo in a drawer in my bedroom. I've never shown it to my parents. I don't know what it means. I don't know who sent it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that hole, about how deep it was, about what might be at the bottom, about whether Danielle is still down there. Story 6. I've always had insomnia. Even as a kid, I'd lie awake for hours staring at the ceiling while everyone else in the house slept. As an adult, I'd mostly accepted it, found ways to work with it. Late shifts as a bartender, overnight freelance work, anything that let me be productive during the hours my brain refused to shut down. Which is how I ended up driving through Narration at 3 in the morning on a random Thursday in August. I picked up a bartending shift in Chillicothe and was driving back to my apartment in Athens. The normal route would have taken me up Route 50, but there was road construction, and the detour signs directed me through a series of back roads I'd never been on before. Narration isn't much of a town, more like a scattered collection of houses and trailers spread out along a valley. No streetlights, no sidewalks, barely any visible infrastructure. Just darkness and trees, and the occasional house light glowing behind curtains. I was following my GPS, but the signal kept cutting out, probably due to the hills blocking the cell towers. I wasn't worried. The road was well marked enough and I figured I'd hit a main highway eventually. That's when I saw the woman standing on the side of the road. She was maybe 30 yards ahead, illuminated by my headlights, just standing there at the edge of the pavement facing the road. She was wearing a dress, pale colored, maybe white or cream, and her hair hung long and straight down her back. My first thought was that she'd broken down, needed help. I slowed down, pulling over to the shoulder. Through my passenger window, I could see her more clearly now. She wasn't looking at me. She was facing forward toward where my car had been heading, like she was waiting for something. I rolled down the window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head to acknowledge me. I put the car in park and opened my door, thinking maybe she couldn't hear me over the engine. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" That's when she turned. Her movement was raw, not fast, not jerky, just raw. Like her entire body rotated as one piece rather than her head turning first. And when she faced me, I saw that where her eyes should have been were just smooth skin. No sockets, no indication there had ever been eyes at all. But she smiled. I got back in the car and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't check to see if she was still there. I just drove faster than I probably should have on those winding roads. About a mile down the road, I saw another figure. This one was male, dressed in dark clothes, standing in someone's driveway. As my headlights swept over him, he raised one hand and waved. Slowly, deliberately, his face was blank too. No eyes, no nose, just smooth pale skin and a mouth that stretched too wide. I kept driving. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. The GPS had completely lost signal now. The screen showed just a blue dot on a gray background with no roads or landmarks. I passed 3 more figures over the next few miles, all standing at the roadside, all featureless, all watching me drive past. The 4th one was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop maybe 20 feet away. The figure didn't move. Just stood there, arms at its sides, head tilted slightly like it was listening to something. I sat there with my foot on the brake, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. I could back up, try to turn around. But the road was narrow and the shoulders were soft. I'd probably end up stuck in a ditch. I could try to go around it, but that would mean driving onto someone's property, and God knows what I'd run into. While I was trying to decide, the figure took a step toward me, then another. Walking slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. I noticed something then. The ones I'd passed before, they'd all been standing still. Static, like statues, but this one was moving. And as it got closer to my headlights, I could see more details. Its skin wasn't smooth. It was scarred, covered in what looked like burn marks or acid damage. The mouth was open, revealing nothing inside. And its fingers, Christ, its fingers were too long, each one maybe a foot in length, hanging down and dragging on the pavement as it walked. I threw the car in reverse and floored it. The car shot backward, tires squealing. I didn't care about turning around anymore. I just needed to get away from that thing. I reversed for maybe 100 yards before the road widened enough for me to attempt a 3-point turn. In the process, my headlights swept across the fields on either side of the road. They were full of figures, dozens of them, maybe more. All standing motionless in the grass, all facing the road, facing me. I got the car turned around and drove back the way I'd come, looking for any turnoff, any alternate route. The figures I'd passed before were gone now. The roadside was empty. After about 2 miles, I saw lights ahead. A gas station, closed but still illuminated. I pulled into the parking lot and just sat there trying to catch my breath. My phone had signal again. I pulled up Google Maps and looked at where I'd been. The road I'd been on was labeled Trigo Creek Road, running through what the map simply identified as Unexplained. I spent the next hour sitting in that gas station parking lot, scrolling through my phone, trying to find any information about what I'd seen. There were stories about Unexplained. It had a reputation, apparently. High crime rate decades ago, drugs and violence. A true crime book had been written about it, but nothing about figures in the night, nothing about eyeless watchers. As the sun started to come up around 5:30, I got back on the road. Took the long way around, back to Route 50, even though it added an hour to the drive. I needed the familiarity of a major highway, the presence of other cars and truck stops and rest areas with fluorescent lights. I made it back to Athens just after 7, went straight to my apartment and locked every door and window, closed all the curtains. I called in sick to my next shift and spent the day sleeping or trying to. That was 6 weeks ago. I haven't driven through Narration since. I won't. I've arranged my schedule so I never have to work late shifts in Chillicothe anymore. But last week I was at a bar in Athens as a customer this time, not working, and I started talking to this guy. Local, grew up in the area. We got on the topic of creepy places in southeastern Ohio, and I mentioned Narration without thinking. His expression changed, got serious in a way that made my stomach drop. "You've seen them," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't know what to say. He leaned in closer. "My uncle lives out that way, used to anyway. He told me about them. Said they come out at night, stand by the roads. No one knows what they are or what they want, but if you stop for them, if you actually get out of your car, they take something from you. Take something. Your features, your face. They wear them for a while, then discard them. That's why they look the way they do, blank. They're between faces." He finished his drink and stood up to leave. Before he walked away, he said one more thing. "My uncle moved away 3 years ago. Said one night he woke up and saw one standing in his bedroom, just standing there at the foot of the bed, watching him sleep. He was gone the next day, left everything behind. Last I heard, he's living in West Virginia now. Won't even drive through Ohio anymore." I haven't been able to stop thinking about that, about the implications. Because if those things can come into houses, can stand in bedrooms watching people sleep, then what's to stop them from? I've been sleeping with the lights on, all of them. Every room in my apartment stays lit 24 hours a day. I tell my roommates it's because of my insomnia, that the light helps somehow. They believe me. But the truth is, I'm terrified of waking up and seeing one of those figures standing in the darkness at the foot of my bed. Terrified of watching it lean down close to my face, that too wide mouth stretching open. Terrified of what happens after that. Story 7. The town of Utopia sits in the absolute middle of nowhere in Clermont County. It's not even really a town, more like a spot on a map where some houses happen to exist near each other. My buddy Keith inherited a property there from his grandmother, a double-wide trailer on about 10 acres of land backing up against the East Fork State Park. Keith wanted to sell it, but the real estate market out there is basically non-existent. So he asked me to help him clear it out, make it look presentable enough to maybe attract a buyer. I owed him a favor. He'd helped me move twice and never asked for anything in return, so I agreed. We drove out on a Saturday morning in September. The property was at the end of a long gravel driveway that wound through thick woods. The trailer itself was in rough shape, siding faded and water-stained, windows covered in grime, front porch sagging dangerously on one side. Keith's grandmother had died 8 months earlier in a nursing home, and the trailer had been sitting empty since then. Keith admitted he'd only been out here twice, once right after she died to secure the property, and once a few months ago to meet with a real estate agent who'd taken one look and said it would be hard to sell, as is. We spent the morning hauling trash bags and broken furniture out to a dumpster Keith had rented. Most of it was standard old person stuff, expired food, outdated magazines, clothes that smelled like mothballs and stale perfume. Around lunchtime, Keith decided to check the shed in the backyard. It was a metal structure maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a padlock that had rusted through. He broke it off with bolt cutters and pulled open the door. Inside was mostly junk, old garden tools, paint cans, a push mower that probably hadn't run in years. But on the back wall was a cork board covered in newspaper clippings. We walked over to look at them. They were all local news articles from the Claremont Courier, dated over the past 20 years. Stories about missing persons, hikers who'd disappeared in East Fork State Park, campers who'd never returned from overnight trips, a couple that had gone fishing and never came home. Maybe 15 or 20 articles total, all carefully cut out and pinned to the board. Keith looked uncomfortable. I didn't know my grandmother was into true crime stuff. But these weren't the kind of articles true crime enthusiasts collect. There were no follow-ups, no resolution stories, no pieces about arrests or trials, just the initial reports, people going missing, searches being conducted, families appealing for information. At the bottom of the board was a hand-drawn map. It showed the property boundaries and the neighboring state park. Someone had marked X's at various locations throughout the park, maybe 24 of them, scattered across several square miles. There was a note pinned next to the map. In shaky handwriting, "They don't cross the property line. The stones keep them back. Don't remove the stones." Keith and I looked at each other. "What stones?" he said. We walked around the property perimeter. It took about 20 minutes to make a full circuit, but we found what the note was referring to. Every 50 feet or so, placed right at the property line, was a stone. Not natural, these were carved, maybe the size of a baseball, with symbols etched into their surfaces. Circles and lines and shapes that didn't look like any language I recognized. Keith counted them. 38 stones total, forming a complete boundary around the property. "This is weird," Keith said, which was an understatement. "My grandmother never mentioned anything about this. And I mean, she was religious, Catholic, but not like occult religious." We went back to the trailer and kept clearing it out, but the whole mood had shifted. What had felt like a mundane, slightly sad chore now felt ominous. I kept glancing out the windows toward the tree line, half expecting to see something looking back. By 6 o'clock, we'd filled the dumpster and loaded everything worth keeping into Keith's truck. The trailer was basically empty now, stripped down to stained carpet and bare walls. Keith said we'd come back tomorrow with cleaning supplies and try to make it look presentable. I offered to stay the night. There was still a working couch and the electricity was on, but Keith said there wasn't enough beer in the world to make him sleep here. We locked up and drove back toward Cincinnati. On the way out, Keith stopped the truck at the end of the driveway. "Hold on," he said, and got out. I watched through the windshield as he walked back toward the property. He was gone for maybe 2 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying one of the carved stones. "Keith," the note said. "It's superstitious bullshit," he said, tossing the stone into the truck bed. My grandmother was losing it at the end. Probably got paranoid living alone out here. I didn't argue, but something about taking that stone felt wrong. We got back to Cincinnati around 8 and went our separate ways. Keith lived in Oakley, I lived in Northside. He said he'd text me in the morning about coming back to finish cleaning. He didn't text. By noon the next day, I tried calling him. It went straight to voicemail. I figured maybe he'd slept in or his phone died. Keith wasn't always great about charging his phone, but by evening I was worried. I drove over to his apartment. His truck was in the parking lot. I knocked on the door for 5 minutes before the neighbor came out and said she'd heard Keith leave early that morning, around 2 or 3 a.m. Said it sounded like he was in a hurry, footsteps running down the stairs. His apartment door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal except for the back sliding door, which was open. And on the carpet in front of the door were muddy footprints, not Keith's. These were bare feet, long, narrow prints with toes that seemed too long, too widely spaced. They led from the sliding door to Keith's bedroom door, then back out again. On his kitchen counter was the stone he'd taken from the property. Next to it was a note in Keith's handwriting. "They came for it. I have to take it back." I tried calling him again, nothing. I drove out to Utopia myself, arriving around 10 p.m. The property was dark. Keith's truck wasn't there. The trailer door was still locked. I walked the perimeter with my phone flashlight. All the stones were still in place except for the one spot where Keith had taken his. That gap was obvious once I knew to look for it. In the dirt, right at the property line where the stone had been, were tracks. The same bare footprints I'd seen in Keith's apartment. Multiple sets of them, leading from the woods onto the property up to the trailer, then back into the woods. I got the hell out of there. I filed a missing persons report the next day. Told the police everything except the part about the carved stones and the footprints. I knew how that would sound. They investigated, questioned Keith's family and friends, checked his bank records and phone records. Nothing. Keith had withdrawn $300 from an ATM at 2 a.m. the night he disappeared, but after that there was no activity. No credit card use, no cell phone pings, just gone. 3 weeks later I got a call from the Clermont County Sheriff's Department. They'd found Keith's truck. It was parked at a trailhead in East Fork State Park, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Keith. They asked me if I knew why he'd go hiking alone in the middle of the night. I said I didn't. They never found him. I drove back out to Utopia one more time about a month ago. I needed to see if the stone was back, if Keith had managed to return it. The property had sold. There was a sold sign at the end of the driveway. I walked up anyway, knowing I was trespassing but not caring. The carved stones were all gone, every single one. The property line was clear, just grass and dirt and nothing marking any kind of boundary. The new owners had removed them. I knocked on the trailer door. A woman answered, mid-30s, tired looking. I asked her how she was liking the place. She said it was fine, though something had been getting into their trash at night. Big, she said. And whatever it was, it didn't leave prints. Just smooth drag marks in the dirt like something sliding across the ground. I told her to be careful. She laughed it off, said it was probably just deer. I wanted to tell her to leave, to get out while she still could, but what would I say? That her property was protected by carved stones and she'd removed them. That something from the woods was going to come for her. She'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am, but I still have nightmares about those footprints in Keith's apartment, about the bare feet with toes too long and space too wide to be human. About Keith driving back to Utopia in the middle of the night, trying to return something he should never have taken. I wonder if he made it, if he put the stone back in its place, or if something found him first in the dark woods where no one would hear him scream. Story 8. I got the job as a night janitor at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums in Fremont when I was 23. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than my previous job at Walmart, and the hours worked fine for my schedule, midnight to 8 a.m., 4 nights a week. The museum complex is actually pretty large. The main house where Hayes lived, a separate library building, and a small museum with exhibits about his presidency and life. Most of my work was in the library building, which housed the archives and research materials. Mopping floors, emptying trash, wiping down study desks. Simple, mindless work that let me listen to podcasts or audiobooks while I cleaned. The building was old, built in the 1960s but designed to look older, with dark wood paneling and these heavy oak doors that always stuck slightly when you opened them. Being there alone at night was a little creepy at first, but I got used to it. Buildings make noise. You learn to tune it out. My supervisor, Donald, was a guy in his early 60s who'd worked for the Hayes Foundation for over 30 years. He gave me my orientation, showed me the cleaning schedule, handed over the keys. Before he left that first night, he gave me one instruction that stuck with me. Don't go into the archive vault after midnight. I laughed thinking he was joking. He didn't laugh back. I'm serious, he said. The vault is temperature and humidity controlled. There's a specific schedule for air circulation. If you interrupt that after hours, you could damage materials that are over 100 years old. So just don't. If you need to clean in there, do it before your shift or after, not during. I said sure, no problem. It seemed like a reasonable request. The vault was in the basement, behind a heavy door that required a special key. It contained the oldest and most fragile materials, Civil War letters, Hayes's personal documents, things preserved in acid-free boxes in climate-controlled darkness. I'd been shown it during orientation but hadn't needed to go in there for any cleaning work. My first few weeks were fine. Boring, actually. I'd show up at midnight, work my way through my checklist of tasks, and leave at 8 when the day staff started arriving. The building was always empty except for me. Then one night in my 4th week, I heard the music. It was around 2 a.m. I was mopping the 2nd floor hallway when I noticed it, faint, barely audible over my headphones. I pulled them out and listened, piano music, coming from somewhere below me. My first thought was that I'd left a computer on somewhere, maybe pulled up a YouTube video before cleaning and forgot to close it. But as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't coming from speakers. It was too organic, too rich. Actual piano keys being pressed. I made my way downstairs following the sound. It was coming from the basement, from behind the vault door. I stood outside the door listening. The music was clearer now, something classical, slow and melancholic. I didn't recognize the piece, but whoever was playing knew what they were doing, no mistakes, no hesitation. But there was no piano in the vault. I'd been in there. It was just shelves and filing cabinets and archival boxes. I knocked on the door. "Hello, is someone in there?" The music stopped immediately. I waited, my hand on the door handle. After a minute of silence, I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The vault was empty, dark except for the small emergency lights that stayed on for safety. No piano, no person, just rows of shelves receding into the darkness. I checked the entire basement before going back to work. Every room, every closet, nobody there. No source for the music. I didn't mention it to Donald. It seemed too weird and I didn't want him to think I was flaking out on the job. But it happened again 3 nights later. Same time, around 2 a.m. Same piano music coming from the vault. This time I didn't knock, just opened the door immediately. The music continued for maybe 3 seconds after I opened the door, then cut off like someone had lifted their hands from the keys mid-song. The vault was empty. I walked between the shelves, checking every corner. Nothing. On my way out, I noticed something on the floor near the door. A piece of paper, yellowed with age. It looked like it had fallen from one of the shelves, though I couldn't figure out which one. I picked it up carefully. It was a letter, written in elegant cursive handwriting, dated 1873. The letter was addressed to President Hayes from someone named Margaret Ellsworth. I only read the first few lines. "Dear Mr. President, I am writing to you in the hopes that you might intercede on behalf of my daughter. She has been missing for 3 weeks now, and the local authorities have ceased their search." I stopped reading and returned the letter to Donald in the morning. He looked at it, frowned, and said he'd return it to the proper collection. That night I heard the music again. This time it was louder, more insistent, and underneath the piano I could hear something else. Singing. A woman's voice, faint and distant, singing along with the melody. I didn't open the vault door. I just stood there in the hallway, listening, my hand clenched around my mop handle like it was a weapon. The singing got louder. Clear enough now that I could make out words, though I didn't understand them, something in another language or maybe just too old for me to parse. Then I heard knocking, from inside the vault. Steady, rhythmic knocking like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the door. The knocking got louder, more frantic. The woman's voice rose in pitch, the singing becoming a wail. Then everything stopped. Silence so complete that I could hear my own breathing, harsh and fast. I left the building. Walked straight out, left my cleaning supplies where they were, got in my car and drove home. I called in sick for my next 2 shifts. When I finally came back, Donald pulled me aside. "Did something happen?" he asked. I didn't want to tell him, but he kept looking at me with this expression like he already knew. "I heard music," I said finally, "from the vault at night." Donald nodded slowly. "Margaret Ellsworth." "What?" "Her daughter disappeared in 1873. Lucy Ellsworth, 16 years old. Hayes actually did intercede, pushed the local authorities to reopen the investigation. They never found her." He paused. "Margaret became obsessed with the case, sent dozens of letters to Hayes pleading for help. Eventually, the letters became incoherent. She was institutionalized in 1875. What does that have to do with?" "Her personal papers are in the vault. Hayes kept them all, stored them in his private collection. Letters, journal entries, even some sheet music she'd composed. She was an accomplished pianist." I stared at him. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not the first night janitor to hear things from the vault. And I'm saying I gave you very clear instructions not to go in there after midnight." He walked away before I could ask anything else. I lasted another 2 weeks. The music continued every night I worked, always around 2 a.m. I stopped going near the basement entirely, just did my cleaning on the upper floors and left the lower levels alone. But on my last night, I made a mistake. I was emptying trash bins on the first floor when I noticed the vault door. It was open. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down at the rectangle of darkness where light was spilling out into the hallway. I'd locked it. I was sure I'd locked it. I locked it every time now, paranoid about leaving it open. From the open doorway came the piano music, louder than ever before, and underneath it, footsteps. Someone walking between the shelves, their shoes clicking on the concrete floor. Then a voice, clear as day, like someone standing right next to me. "Come help me find her." I quit the next day. Didn't even give 2 weeks notice, just called Donald and told him I wasn't coming back. He didn't try to convince me to stay. I found out later that the position has high turnover. Night janitors rarely last more than a month. Donald keeps hiring new people, keeps giving them the same warning about the vault. None of them listen. And eventually, they all hear the music. I work at a grocery store now. Day shift, fluorescent lights, background music playing through ceiling speakers. It's boring and the pay is worse, but I don't mind. Because I never have to work alone in a basement, listening to a dead woman play piano while she searches for a daughter who disappeared 150 years ago. Listening to her call out for help that never came. Story 9. Adrienne and I had been dating for about 6 months when she invited me to her family's cabin in Vinton County. It was supposed to be a romantic weekend, hiking, campfires, disconnecting from city life. Her family owned about 60 acres of wooded property with a small cabin her grandfather had built back in the 80s. We drove down on a Friday afternoon in late October. The cabin was remote, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through state forest land. Cell service cut out about 5 miles from the property. Adrienne said that was part of the appeal, total disconnection. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a wood stove, a kitchen with a propane stove, and an old refrigerator that ran on generator power. There was a well for water and an outhouse about 50 feet from the main building. Adrienne's family had been using the place for years. She'd spent summers there as a kid, said it was her favorite place in the world. We spent Friday evening settling in, building a fire, cooking dinner. Everything was perfect, exactly the peaceful getaway we both needed. As the sun set, we sat on the porch and watched the forest darken around us. That's when Adrienne mentioned the bells. "If you hear bells at night," she said casually, Just ignore them. I laughed, thinking she was setting up a ghost story. Bells. Yeah, little bells like sleigh bells. They ring sometimes in the woods at night. My family has always heard them. We don't know what it is. Maybe wind chimes from an old homestead, maybe some kind of animal behavior we don't understand. But my grandfather's rule was you don't go investigate. You just let them ring and stay inside. She said it with such matter-of-fact seriousness that I didn't know how to respond. Has anyone ever checked it out? My uncle did once, back in the 90s. He followed the sound one night, said he'd prove it was nothing supernatural. She paused. He came back about 20 minutes later, wouldn't talk about what he saw. Packed up his stuff first thing in the morning and left. Hasn't been back to the cabin since. I wanted to ask more questions, but Adrian changed the subject and I let it drop. We went to bed around 11. The cabin was quiet except for the wood stove ticking as it cooled. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive and the fresh air. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of bells. They were distant but clear, cutting through the silence of the forest. A gentle tinkling sound, like someone shaking a handful of small bells in rhythm. It seemed to be coming from the north, deeper into the property. Beside me, Adrian stirred but didn't wake. I laid there listening, remembering her warning. The bells continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited, but they didn't start again. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to Adrian. She just nodded. Told you. It happens most nights. You get used to it. We spent Saturday hiking around the property. Adrian showed me the various landmarks, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the remains of an old barn foundation, a spring house her grandfather had used for cold storage. As we walked, I noticed markings on some of the trees, blazes like trail markers, but they didn't seem to follow any logical path. Adrian said her grandfather had put them up, though she didn't know why. Some kind of property boundary system, she guessed. Around noon, we reached the northern edge of the property, where the family land met state forest. There was a distinct line on one side. Adrian's family had cleared some undergrowth and maintained rough trails. On the other side, everything was wild and overgrown. We don't go past this point, Adrian said. Grandfather's rules. Why? She shrugged. He said the land past here was occupied, never explained what he meant. We headed back to the cabin. Cooked an early dinner, played cards, watched the sun set from the porch again. Everything felt peaceful, normal. Then around 9 p.m. we heard the bells again, much earlier than the night before and much louder. Adrian's expression changed. She looked worried. That's not right, she said quietly. What do you mean? They never ring this early, and never this close. They're usually way out in the woods. We sat there listening. The bells were ringing continuously now, not stopping, and they were moving. I could hear them getting closer, circling around the cabin from the north toward the west. Adrian stood up. We should go inside. I followed her in. She locked the door, which seemed overly cautious, but I didn't question it. Through the windows, we could still hear the bells now on the western side of the cabin. Then they stopped. Complete silence. We waited. After about 5 minutes, Adrian started to relax. Maybe it was. Someone knocked on the door. 3 firm knocks, deliberate and clear. Adrian and I looked at each other. She raised one finger to her lips, signaling me to stay quiet. Another 3 knocks. Adrian walked to the window and carefully looked outside. I saw her face go pale. "What is it?" I whispered. She backed away from the window, shaking her head. She grabbed my hand and pulled me into the bedroom, closing the door behind us. "There's someone outside," she said quietly, standing at the door. "Should we see what they want?" "No," her voice was firm. "We don't open the door, we don't respond, we wait." "Adrian, if someone's lost or hurt." "They're not lost." More knocking, louder now. Then a voice muffled through the door. "Is anyone home? I need help, please." It was a woman's voice. She sounded elderly, frightened. I moved toward the bedroom door, but Adrian grabbed my arm. "Don't. Someone needs help." "No," Adrian said. "They don't trust me." "Please." The knocking continued, becoming more insistent. The woman's voice called out again. "Please, my grandson is hurt. I need to use your phone." I pulled away from Adrian and went to the main room. Through the window, I could see a figure standing at the door. An old woman, hunched and frail-looking, wearing what looked like a nightgown. I reached for the door handle. "Stop." Adrian's shout made me freeze. She was standing in the bedroom doorway, her face pale and terrified. "Look at her shadow," Adrian said. I looked back at the window. The porch light was on, casting a clear shadow from the woman, but the shadow was wrong. It didn't match her form. While she appeared small and hunched, her shadow stretched tall and elongated, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. As I watched, the woman's head rotated all the way around, a full 180 degrees, until she was looking backward over her shoulder. But her body hadn't moved, just her head. She smiled. I stumbled away from the door. The woman thing at the door raised one hand and knocked again, 3 times. Then she walked away, disappearing around the corner of the cabin. We heard the bells again, moving away from the cabin back toward the north. Adrian and I didn't sleep that night. We stayed in the main room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. The bells rang periodically throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant. At first light, we packed our things and left. Didn't even clean up properly, just threw everything in the car and drove out as fast as the dirt road would allow. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? About a week later, Adrian mentioned that she'd called her father, told him what happened. He'd gotten quiet on the phone, then said he'd been hearing stories about the bells since he was a child. His father, Adrian's grandfather, had warned the family about them. Said something lived in the woods to the north, something old that occasionally came out at night. The blazes on the trees weren't property markers. They were a boundary line, a warning. As long as you stayed on the marked side, you were safe. But if you crossed over or if you responded to the bells, you were acknowledging them, inviting them in. Adrian's uncle had crossed the boundary that night in the 90s. Whatever he'd seen on the other side was enough to keep him away forever. Adrian's father said the family was going to sell the property. Too much liability, too many close calls over the years. Better to let it go back to wilderness than risk someone getting hurt. I asked Adrian if she believed that something would actually hurt someone. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My grandfather died in 2015. Heart attack, they said. But my grandmother found him outside the cabin at dawn, lying in the grass. He was covered in these tiny wounds, like something had pricked him all over with needles. And in his hand, he was clutching a small brass bell. The property sold last spring to a developer. They're planning to clear some of the land, build vacation cabins for weekend rentals. I wonder if they'll keep the tree blazes, if they'll understand what they mean, if they'll warn their guests about the bells." Story 10. My name is Ellis Carmichael, and I used to work for the Hocking County Highway Department. Road maintenance, mostly filling potholes, clearing debris, replacing signs. It was steady work, decent pay, and I'd been doing it for almost 12 years when the incident happened. In March of last year, we got reports of a sinkhole on Township Road 214, a rural route that cuts through the southern part of the county. Sinkholes aren't uncommon in Ohio. We've got plenty of limestone underground that occasionally collapses. Usually they're small, maybe a few feet across. We fill them with gravel and asphalt, compact it down, move on. But this one was different. The report said it was about 12 feet in diameter, right in the middle of the road, big enough to swallow a car. My supervisor, Frank, sent me and another guy named Joel out to assess it. Standard procedure. We'd evaluate the damage, determine if we could fix it ourselves, or if we needed to bring in a contractor. We drove out there on a Thursday morning. Township Road 214 was one of those roads that barely qualified as maintained 2 lanes, no shoulders, trees pressing in from both sides. We passed maybe 3 houses over 5 miles. The sinkhole was exactly where the report said, about half a mile past the last house. Joel whistled when he saw it. That's a big one. The hole was massive, easily 15 feet across now that we were looking at it in person. The edges were irregular, chunks of asphalt and dirt crumbling into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it down. I couldn't see the bottom. The beam just disappeared into black. "How deep do you think?" Joel asked. I grabbed a rock and dropped it in. We listened. 5 seconds passed. 10. No sound of impact. "That's not right," I said. We spent the next hour taking measurements, setting up warning signs and barriers to keep any vehicles from getting near it. Joel called Frank to report, said we'd need the engineering team to come out and assess stability before we could attempt any kind of repair. That should have been the end of it. We should have left, written up our report, let the engineers handle it. But while Joel was on the phone, I kept looking at the hole. Something about it bothered me. The edges were too smooth, too precise. Sinkholes usually have rough, collapsed edges where the ground gave way gradually. This looked like something had been punched through from below, a clean circle like a plug had been removed. And there was a smell, faint but raw, not the earthy smell you'd expect from exposed soil. This was organic, almost sweet, like rotting fruit. Joel finished his call. "Frank says secure the site and come back. Engineers will be out tomorrow or Monday." We were packing up our equipment when we heard it, a voice, coming from the hole, distant, echoing but clear enough to make out words. "Hello, is someone up there? I need help." Joel and I looked at each other, then we looked at the hole. "Did you hear?" Joel started. "Yeah." The voice called out again. "Please, I've been down here for hours, my leg is broken." I got down on my hands and knees at the edge of the hole, shining my flashlight down. Still couldn't see anything. "Hello, where are you? How far down?" No response, just silence. Then the voice came again, and this time I realized something was wrong with it. The voice was exactly the same as before, same words, same inflection, same emphasis. Like a recording being played. "Hello, is someone up there? I need help." Joel grabbed my shoulder. "Ellis, we should go." He was right, this felt wrong. But the idea that someone might actually be down there, hurt and calling for help, I couldn't shake it. "We need to at least check," I said. "If someone's hurt and we just leave." "That's not a person." "You don't know that." Joel pointed at the hole. "Then why hasn't he responded to you?" "You called down, a real person would answer." Before I could respond, the voice came again. "Please, I've been down here for hours, my leg is broken." Exactly the same, word for word. "It's a loop," Joel said. "Someone's messing with us, let's get out of here." We loaded our equipment and drove back to the maintenance yard. I wrote up a report mentioning the sinkhole dimensions and recommended engineering assessment. I didn't mention the voice. Joel didn't either, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night at home, I researched sinkholes in Hocking County, trying to find any historical records of similar formations. I found plenty of geological surveys, but nothing about a sinkhole on Township Road 214. What I did find were missing persons reports. 3 people over the past 20 years all disappearing along that stretch of road. A driver in 2003, a cyclist in 2011, a jogger in 2017. None of them ever found. Monday morning, Frank called me into his office. "Engineers went out to that sinkhole," he said. They couldn't find it. What? Road's fine, no damage. They checked the whole stretch of 214, no sinkhole, no depression, nothing. I stared at him. That's impossible. We took measurements, we set up barriers. I know, but it's not there now. He paused. Did anything unusual happen when you were out there? I hesitated, then I told him about the voice. Frank's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly. Joel mentioned something similar. What the hell is going on? Frank opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Old, worn, filled with papers yellowed with age. He slid it across the desk to me. Inside were reports. Highway Department reports dating back to 1982, all concerning Township Road 214. Descriptions of sinkholes appearing and disappearing. Accounts of voices calling from underground. Witness statements from various maintenance workers over the years. One report, dated 1989, included a handwritten note from the worker. Whatever is under that road, it's trying to lure people down. Don't respond. Don't investigate. Just mark it and leave. I looked up at Frank. Why didn't you warn us? Would you have believed me if I had told you there was something supernatural about a sinkhole? Or would you have thought I was crazy? He took the folder back. Now you know. If you ever get a call about that stretch of road again, you refuse the assignment. You tell me and I'll handle it. Handle it how? By ignoring it, that's all we can do. Mark it, barrier it if we can, and leave. It always closes up eventually. I transferred to a different department 3 months later. I couldn't keep working roads knowing what was under some of them. Couldn't drive through the county without wondering what might be beneath the asphalt. Joel quit entirely. Last I heard, he moved to Columbus. But sometimes I think about Township Road 214. About those missing persons. About where they might have ended up. I think about that voice calling for help, playing on loop forever in the darkness. And I wonder how many people heard it and didn't walk away. How many looked down into that hole and saw something looking back? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.